So perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sebastian Sabato, Senior Researcher at the European Social Observatory, a Brussels-based research institute and think tank analyzing the social dimension of the process of European integration. And today I would like to discuss a bit with you on EU initiatives on affordable and sustainable housing, through discussing in particular initiatives taken under the previous Commission in the European Green Deal period and what is on the agenda right now under the current Commission, the second von der Leyen Commission. So I would like to start with some introductory remarks, just to explain some key topics or some key notions, or at least how I'm going to use them. Then I would like to talk about EU initiatives on affordable and sustainable housing during the European Green Deal period, and then let's say what has been done in the last over the last 2 years, that is starting from 2025. This before some preliminary conclusions, because some initiatives are quite recent, so do not really allow for final conclusion, let's say it like that. I would like to adopt, first of all, a just transition perspective on housing and on EU initiatives in this policy domain, starting from a definition of just transition quite broad, that is the need to identify and address the possible uneven implications of policies for the green transition, and to distribute fairly costs and opportunities, also at the same time ensuring a meaningful involvement of stakeholders and citizens in the making of decisions. I think that this relates pretty well to two requirements, in a way, two aspects of housing policies, that is their sustainability and their affordability. So on housing, a just transition perspective would require combining these two dimensions. Sustainability in terms of environmental and climate impact of housing, because according to data from the European Environmental Agency, buildings are responsible for more than 40% of the EU's final energy consumption, 52% of natural gas consumptions, and around 1/3 of annual greenhouse gases emissions, plus the consumption of material. So this relates to housing sustainability and affordability, that although there is no shared definition of affordability for housing, let's say it's understood by the European Commission or in EU discourses, some EU discourses, as the relationship between housing cost and household income. So if housing costs are too high compared to household income, let's say housing is not affordable. And this concerns both upfront cost for buying and renting a property and running housing costs, such as utilities and so on. So this is what I mean by a just transition perspective on EU housing initiatives. And into details, as already said, I'll deal with the two distinct periods. And for each of them, I would like to give, first of all, an overview of the broader policy and political context at the EU level, of course, in relation to what is our interest or as an impact on housing policies, and then a description of the main initiatives that attempt to combine housing affordability and sustainability. I not describe, to start into details, the European Green Deal period. you know that the European Green Deal was the, let's say, growth strategy of the previous Commission, aiming at transforming the EU into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. And a growth strategy centered around an overarching climate objective that is still on, by the way, that is achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And in order to do this, let's say the EU envisaged a green transition pattern that is trying to combine EU climate environmental objectives with a pattern of sustainable green growth under a policy paradigm called of competitive sustainability. Again, here trying to combine 4 pillars in the growth strategy: environmental sustainability, macroeconomic stability, productivity, and social fairness. What was very interesting of the European Green Deal strategy was, let's say, the awareness that not only synergies could be developed among achieving ecological, economic, and social objectives, but that also the EU would have been confronted with important trade-off. And in particular, the awareness that the green transition would not have been automatically socially fair and would not have reduced per se social inequalities. Hence, in the 2019 Commission communication on the European Green Deal, there was this call for a just green transition, as already said, fairly distributing the opportunities from the transition and attenuating the risk deriving from these transformations under the mantra, leaving no one behind, no regions, no individuals, no social groups. This the strategy as was thought at the very beginning, going more concretely. The European Green Deal was based on 8 areas for action and related implementation means. One of the 8 areas I think is particularly relevant for rehousing, and it's the 8th area concerning building and renovating in an energy and resource efficient way. This was among the key areas for action of the 2019 European Green Deal. And in order to deliver on that ambition, in 2020, the Renovation Wave for Europe strategy was published by the European Commission. A strategy relying on 2 main objectives. First, at least doubling the annual energy renovation rate of residential and non-residential buildings by 2030. And second, fostering deep energy renovations. So if we refer here to the 2 dimensions of housing, sustainability and affordability, in the main objectives of the renovation wave of the strategy, let's say there is a strong focus on the sustainability dimension. But not only that, because anyways, among the key principles of the strategy, there was also ensuring affordability. That is making energy performing and sustainable building widely available, in particular for medium and low income households and vulnerable people and areas. And similarly, among the lead actions and the focus areas of the renovation wave strategy, there were using renovation as a lever to address energy poverty and access to healthy housing for all households, and again tackling energy poverty and the worst performing buildings, often hosting the most vulnerable groups in society, And finally, let's say, according to the strategy, a lot of attention should be played in renovation, energy efficient renovation of public buildings and social infrastructure, including social housing. This was the beginning of the strategy. This was 2019 and 2020. Then, let's say, with all its limitations, the European Green Deal, including the renovation wave strategy, have been implemented between 2020 and 2024. Implemented through a number of initiatives, including, I'm sure you already know these initiatives I'm going to mention, legislative initiatives, meaning binding initiatives from the member states, the revised Energy Efficiency Directive, Renewable Energy Directive, and Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. A directive obviously means that it's EU legislation to which national legislations have to adapt, should be implemented at the national level. Non-legislative, so more voluntary initiatives, such as the Council recommendation on ensuring a fair transition towards climate neutrality and the Commission recommendation on energy poverty, but also through implementation of the renovation wave strategy to some extent, through EU financial instruments, including the Just Transition Fund, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and importantly, the Repower EU instrument, the European Regional Development Fund, and the Social Climate Fund. I don't want really to go into details of all these initiatives, but I would like just to propose some general considerations when looking at them together. So if we look at these EU initiatives, we can see that there is a link when it comes to housing between housing sustainability and affordability. If we try to look in terms of directions, let's say it's more a preoccupation that, let's say, about the affordability of sustainable housing. There is a strong focus on making the housing stock sustainable, in particular energy efficient, and while doing this, also to make sure that access is ensured to low revenue households and vulnerable groups, so that the housing stock is also affordable. There is a strong focus on renovations of buildings and addressing energy poverty by increasing the energy efficiency of buildings emerge as a recurrent theme in both legislative initiatives and in part in financial instruments. I say, in a way, the approach can be resumed in a way, synthesized to what is well expressed in the revised Energy Efficiency Directive. That is sustainability and housing sustainability and affordability should be ensured by combining, let's say, the energy efficiency first principle, that is providing incentives to make buildings energy efficient, coupled with a recommendation from the European Union to the member states in doing so to prioritize support to the most vulnerable groups of the population. This is more the affordability aspect. And in particular, as I said, specific attention to individuals and households in situations of energy poverty or at risk of energy poverty. And also relevant for our lecture today, the second basic principle, let's say, principle in the revised Energy Efficiency Directive is the exemplary role of the public sector in promoting this renovation for energy efficiency wave. Let's say the public sector should lead by example, so ensuring energy efficiency of public buildings and welfare social infrastructure, including in some countries, this include social housing. If this is a short, let's say, overview of the European Green Deal period, I would like to move now to the current period, the current Commission, that in many respects looks like, at least here from Brussels, a totally different world. Also considering that the world is very different from 2020. So let's say that when we talk about the broader overall policy framework, I say that we are in the post-European Green Deal period because while achieving climate neutrality by 2050 as an overall objective has been confirmed, including intermediate steps in 2030 and 2040, but the European Green Deal is not anymore, let's say, the overarching EU growth strategy. Let's say this role has been taken up by other initiatives such as the Competitiveness Compass, or very important within the Competitiveness Compass, the Clean Industrial Deal. If before, let's say, the overarching policy paradigm was, as I mentioned, competitive sustainability, now let's say the talk is more about sustainable competitiveness or competitiveness full stop. So the accent, at least at the discursive level, is not so much about sustainability, but about the priority of making the EU competitive. Making the EU competitive also through simplification of existing legislation, including environmental legislation that, according to some, a bit hamper, impedes European competitiveness. And let's say we don't talk that much anymore, or at least the EU does not talk that much anymore about the green transition, but the clean transition. This is a rhetorical tool just to make understand that there has been a change that is based on the ambition to creating a closer link between decarbonization efforts, competitiveness, and a relaunched European industrial policy. So the climate neutrality objective by 2050 is still there, but many changes have happened with, let's say, even more emphasis than before on competitiveness and on relaunching industrial policy. When it comes to the social dimension of this competitiveness compass of the Clean Industrial Deal, let's say the cornerstones are increasing skills, because in order to have, according to the reasoning, to have a more competitive economy, we need a skilled workforce, especially digital skills, but also trying at the same time to ensure that new jobs and existing jobs are quality jobs. So the EU in this respect has elaborated a union skills strategy and a quality jobs roadmap. However, again, among the key initiatives foreseen in the Competitiveness Compass, there was also, it was announced in beginning of 2025 and 2024, let's say the enactment of an affordable housing plan and an action plan for affordable energy to address energy poverty. because actually what was surprising for some observers, it happened that at least on paper, housing, the topic of housing, grew in political silence in the EU agenda under the current Commission, with explicit references to a situation of housing crisis in the EU. Let's say the existence of a housing crisis in the member states was overtly stated by EU institutions. So growing political silence of the topic of housing, that can be seen that in the current commission, for the first time we have a commissioner for energy and housing. It's the first time that housing is mentioned in the title of a commissioner. The European Parliament had already established in December 2024 a special committee on the housing crisis in the EU that recently come up with the recommendations and then a parliament resolution. There was a high-level conference on affordable and sustainable housing in September 2025, I think in Copenhagen, if I'm not wrong, because it was organized by the Danish presidency, semestral presidency of the Council of the EU. And very important at the political level, for the first time ever, a debate on housing took place at the European Council. So EU head of states or government discussed about housing and came up with the presidency conclusions on the future European affordable housing plan. This debate took place in October 2025. So, given, let's say, the centrality that this European affordable housing plan is taken and is expected to take more and more in housing policies, at least at the European level, the second part of my presentation will be actually devoted to presenting the main elements of the European Affordable Housing Plan. Again, looking at the two elements around which this speech is structured, affordability and sustainability. So the Affordable Housing Plan is actually a Commission communication published in December 2025. In this initiative, let's say, in terms of approach, let's say, access to housing is depicted as both a fundamental right, of course, but also a precondition to enhance European competitiveness, in the sense that in many respects, the housing crisis, affordability crisis, threatens competitiveness, among others, because it limits labor and educational mobility, thereby exacerbating labor shortages in growth pools, in the sense that in many areas, access to housing is so complex that creates remarkable difficulties, for instance, not only for students, but also for essential workers. So in this sense, the housing crisis threatens competitiveness of European economy. The ambition is still to simultaneously pursuing social, environmental, and economic objectives through housing policies. And indeed, the ambition is that housing should be affordable, sustainable, and quality housing. And when it comes to the link between housing sustainability and affordability, let's say the approach is that energy efficient, resilient homes with the lowest possible carbon footprint would increase affordability, housing affordability, because would reduce in the medium and long term maintenance and utility costs while enhancing long-term value. This is a bit how the issue of the relationship between housing sustainability and affordability is depicted in the European Affordable Housing Plan. And then, let's say the plan is based on kind of a needs assessment analysis. According to Commission data, let's say the EU, in order to match current housing demands, the EU will need more than 2 million homes per year. That means adding about 650,000 homes to the current stock with a remarkable cost. That is what is foreseen is a cost of about 150 billion euros annually. It's quite enormous. And the diagnosis of the problem is that the housing crisis is due to a variety of reasons. This you know much better than me, the multi-dimensionality of the phenomenon, including what's highlighted in the Commission communication, the financialisation of the housing market, insufficient investment in affordable and social housing, and growing income inequality in the EU. There is an identification of the most affected groups by the housing crisis. That is, of course, housing exclusion disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, and the most disadvantaged groups in society are increasingly facing the risk of homelessness, but also the acknowledgement that a growing number of middle-income households are facing difficulties accessing affordable quality housing. And there is also a recognition of the territorial dimension of the housing crisis, with a focus, let's say, on the strong pressure, especially in cities and popular tourist destinations. We will come back later on this aspect. More concretely, the plan is based on 4 pillars where, according to the European Commission, action is needed. That is boosting housing supply, mobilizing investment, enabling immediate support while driving longer-term reforms, and supporting the most affected. And action, let's say in the plan, also 10 key areas for action within these pillars where the EU action can add value are identified. So I'll try to go through these pillars, but not focusing too much, not equally focusing on all the key areas for action, but only on the ones that maybe are more interesting for our purposes. So when it comes to the need to boost housing supply, the European Commission recognizes the need for a substantial increase in new homes, including expanding the social and affordable housing stock. At the same time, we need new homes, but also there is the need to try to maximize the efficient use of the existing building stock. So renovation instead of building new houses. We'll come back later on this aspect, but this is a kind of a bit of an implicit tension within the strategy. Among the actions foreseen in order to boost supply, I would like to raise your attention on Action 2, that is about cutting red tape to accelerate housing supply, meaning simplifying reporting for the construction sector and reducing administrative burdens, and whenever necessary, speeding up environmental assessments and permits. As for action 3, that is more about combining affordability, sustainability, and quality in housing, again, the main emphasis is on renovation in order to address, especially in order to address energy efficiency. As for the second pillar about mobilizing investment, a very important element is the engagement by the Commission to try to increase funding for housing policies in the next long-term EU budget, but also trying to mobilize additional public and private investment through an action plan for affordable and sustainable housing by the European Investment Bank, and by setting up a pan-European investment platform for affordable and sustainable housing. The second action in this domain would be to enable faster and simpler public support for social and affordable housing. Here the idea is through a revision of state aid rules to authorize the use of public funds for the construction of affordable housing, including for middle-class families, what might be a bit complex under the current EU state aid rules. The third pillar is about enabling immediate support while driving reforms. Here it's very interesting because the European Commission engages in defining a framework for public authorities to identify stressed housing areas and let's say to better define what kind of targeted and proportionate actions may be taken to manage short-term rentals. There is quite a lot of attention about the implication in terms of housing affordability of the development of short-term rentals. It's for this reason that one of the focus areas I mentioned before was touristic areas. And actions is EU action, including legislation is expected in this area. But again, another action is, let's say, trying to driving forward member states' structural reforms in the housing sector, again, in order to reduce national, regional, and local red tapes and mobilizing investment in administrative capacity and digital solutions in this respect, but also trying to help the member states in reversing declining trends about social housing, availability and construction, and also reforms concerning taxation. The last pillar of the plan is to support the most affected. And again, here, among the categories that are most affected by the housing crisis, according to the European Commission, I mentioned young people and students. So action is expected in these for these groups, social groups, and importantly, addressing homelessness and supporting tenants and households in vulnerable situations. Here again, for the moment, what is expected, what is in the pipeline, apparently is non-legislative initiatives such as a future council recommendation on fighting housing exclusion, an engagement in finding way to help the member states to increase the social housing stock, and important to push them to adopt, when it comes to homelessness, housing first solutions that proved effective in various European contexts. And again, an ambition to, let's say, commitments to eradicating energy poverty and trying to protect disadvantaged people from disconnection from energy supply. this will be part of another package that is the citizens energy package. So after this, I realized quite quick overview of what were the main elements of a previous EU action under the European Green Deal in terms of linking housing sustainability and affordability, and the current strategy that is the EU affordable housing plans. I would like to present and maybe later discuss some preliminary conclusions. Preliminary in the sense that, as I said, the affordable housing plan was presented in December 2025, and it's still in the very first stages of its implementation. So it's difficult to give more comprehensive conclusions and assessments. But what for the moment is usually considered by observers as a positive development under the current Commission with the EU affordable housing plans is, let's say, it's considered as a step from moving from more selective action by the EU in the domain of housing towards, let's say, more comprehensive EU housing policies. We don't know if it's, let's say, the development of this policy area at the EU level in the making, always considering that housing is a competence of the member states. So there are limits in what the EU can do in this area, and especially in the instruments that can be used. What we observe is a broadening of the target groups of these policies, let's say more emphasis than in the past on the middle class households, increasingly faced with housing affordability issues, while recognizing the most vulnerable as a priority group. And when it comes to the most vulnerable, and especially people experiencing homelessness, let's say a quite explicit emphasis, not new, but more than in the past, about successful approaches such as housing first models that are openly presented as a model for member states that are not relying on these approaches. What's to be watched? Here, it's a very preliminary and provisional, I would say, consideration. Observing initiatives under the European Green Deal and how the balance between affordability and sustainability of housing is presented in the affordable housing plan, let's say beyond the discursive level, we should look if there is a movement in a way from, let's say, an approach that was of the previous period that ensure the priority to ensuring the affordability from some groups of sustainable housing to ensuring the sustainability of affordable housing. What I mean here is that might be linguistic nuances, but maybe not, in the sense we all agree that affordability and sustainability of housing should not see as alternatives. But quite often in policy, even when we try to integrate things, there are priorities or main focuses. I have the impression that under the European Green Deal initiatives in the previous period, let's say, the focus was in increasing the improving the sustainability of the housing while making sure that sustainable housing are also affordable. Here, the focus look more on broadening the availability of affordable housing, also making sure that they are sustainable, that everything works quite well in principle when, let's say, both objectives can be achieved. But will it be like that? I try to explain this better in the sense that among the potential limitations of the strategy and the shortcomings identified by observers, sorry, there is the environmental impact of the plan. In the sense, as I already said, there is a certain tension between the need to build new buildings and the need also for environmental purposes just to renovate to the extent of the possible, as much as possible, the existing stock. But especially there is an emphasis of simplification of procedures, including when it comes to environmental standards, that according to some observers might lead to lowering these standards, lowering environmental standards. Some observers see this risk. So let's say maybe moving the focus towards, let's say, giving priority to the availability of more affordable housing solutions, maybe even if it's not stated obviously explicitly, but maybe in the facts, lowering a bit the sustainability dimension. As I said, it's something to be watched. It's just a preliminary observation. And to conclude about the potential limitations of the strategy, first of all, financial resources. I mentioned at the very beginning, let's say, the amount of money that will be needed every year in order to address the needs identified by the European Commission. So one of the instruments to ensure resources will be the next multi-annual financial framework that is being debated right now. But from what we see, let's say it's not that resources for social for sure and probably climate priorities are going to increase. So a big plan, an ambitious plan, will there be enough resources, enough EU resources, but also enough investment by the member states? In this sense, what we observe is, let's say, a dynamic under the EU economic governance, a dynamic that some observers defined as of austerity 2.0, in the sense an increased pressure on the member states to keep public budgets under control. To what extent is this coherent with the invitation, the recommendation to intervene in a more decisive way in the housing market, especially when it comes to affordable and the social housing? And fourthly, a third actually limitations identified is the fact that the affordable housing plan might be too timid when it comes to addressing the issue of housing financialisation, identified as one of the main drivers of the housing crisis in the EU. And let's say the final criticism is about timing. In the sense we have an ambitious plan that will take time to implement in what is defined as a burning crisis situation. So these are my, that's all from my side for the moment. And thank you for your attention.